So why do we care about climate change in the Great Lakes region? Well, first of all, if we take a look at the observed record over the last century, winter temperatures are increasing, believe it or not. It's giving us longer growing seasons, but it's also giving us later freeze and earlier thaw on our rivers and lakes, dramatic decreases in the ice cover on the Great Lakes, and declining lake levels. If you look at precipitation, there's generally more precipitation on an annual basis, but it's coming at us in more intense storms and longer periods of drought during the summer. And the projections beyond this, into 2050 and beyond, we're looking at annual temperature increases of 5 degrees Fahrenheit, adding an extra month to the growing season and to the golfing season for those that care. Average precipitation will be up by about 5%, but it'll be higher in the winter by about 10% and actually lower during the summer. We're looking at perhaps twice as many storms, mostly coming as rain and longer summer droughts. The impacts associated with those could be likely increases in extreme heat and the impacts on heat stress and related deaths, declines in cold temperature species, increases in nutrient pollution and fish kills, increases in property damage due to storms and flooding, declines in winter recreation and tourism. To deal with the unavoidable changes, we need to learn how to adapt, but to avoid the worst impacts, we need to reduce greenhouse gases. And as the climate debate has clearly moved from a scientific discussion to political debates, it's really important to understand what the public sentiment is about that. So I'm looking forward to what the panelists tell us about what the public has been saying about this. I'm going to introduce all three panelists, and then they'll come up in turn and give their presentations. We'll do Q&A after the fact when we're all done, and there are cards around here. If you could write your questions down and pass them on to people who'll be collecting them, I'll sort of moderate the Q&A after we're done. So our first presenter is Barry Ray. Barry's right here in the first thing. Barry is a professor of public policy in Ford School, and he holds appointments in the School of Natural Resources and Programming of the Environment. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. In 2006, Barry became the first social scientist to receive EPA's Climate Protection Award, and in 2009 was named a fellow in the National Academy of Public Administration. And I also want to take this opportunity for all of us to congratulate Barry for also becoming the Arthur Thurnau Professor here at the University of Michigan, recognition for his outstanding contribution to undergraduate education. Barry's going to open the discussion with a summary of existing state, provincial, and regional policies, and he'll focus on renewable energy mandates and proposed regional cap-and-trade systems, and introduce key findings from the Michigan portion of this year's survey. Following Barry will be Chris Borick, the second person in there. Chris is a political scientist and director of the Institute of Public Opinion at Muhlenberg College. His nationally recognized public opinion research has included more than 200 large-scale public opinion surveys, the results of which often find themselves in Time Magazine, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, LA Times, and the Washington Post. Chris has won numerous teaching awards, most recently the Lindback Distinguished Teaching Award at Muhlenberg. And Chris is going to review the findings of the U.S. National Survey, including national trends and comparisons to the Michigan findings. And then third, Eric LaChapelle will be joining us. He joined the faculty at the University of Montreal in 2010. His thesis focused on cross-national differences in rates of carbon energy taxation across 21 OECD countries. In addition to his research on comparative politics of carbon pricing, his studies include the politics of scientific expertise and public attitudes towards climate change policy. And Eric will present results from the Parallel Canadian survey and outline comparisons of how U.S. and Canadian citizens responded to the same set of questions. So I'm looking forward to the panel. I hope you are, and we'll start off with Barry.
As Don was suggesting, the bulk of our presentations will focus on public opinion issues, American, Canadian perspectives in a number of areas of climate, but want to open with a bit of discussion on policy considerations that make the Great Lakes or a Great Lakes perspective especially relevant. The photo that you see is only a couple of years ago. This was an event in the Rose Garden with the president, 3 governors, 2 former governors, at a moment where it seemed as if American climate policy was really shifting from a decade of intensive state experimentation and experience to the hands of the federal government. This is the point where President Obama is working out a negotiation on corporate average fuel economy, but a month after that, a major piece of legislation passes the House of Representatives that, had it been enacted by the Senate and signed into law, would have frozen a good number of existing state programs, including the 3 regional carbon cap and trade programs, for a period of at least 5 years. At that point, it seemed as if climate policy was going to be dealing with Great Lakes issues. It would be climate policy certainly set in Washington, D.C., rather than in Lansing or on a regional basis. As we come together today, clearly the 111th Congress has entered into the history books with no major enactments. There is a remarkable process underway by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, is trying to revisit 1990 clean air legislation and negotiate with all 50 states, including Michigan, what it would be like to issue greenhouse gas permits for large emitting facilities, although that is a policy with great uncertainty and real doubts about how far that will go and be implemented. But as we begin to think about next issues and steps, in many respects, the legacies and responsibilities ride rather heavily in state and arguably provincial. Eric will be talking more about the Canadian policy piece, the sub-federal dimensions of this, much as they have been for the last decade or so. And so states have some issues, and states have some choices, including, as Don was suggesting, Michigan. If you're looking at states in green, those are states that have statutory requirements to steadily increase over the next decade or more the amount of electricity that's derived from renewable sources. It's a policy tool, a climate policy tool known as a portfolio standard, a renewable portfolio standard. And interesting to think of the vast majority of states in the Great Lake Basin that have this piece and this policy in play. We might think, given the events of the last Congress, that carbon cap and trade is in fact dead. Well, that's not true if you look at the sub-federal level. If you're looking at jurisdictions in blue here, those are entities, American states, that are entering into their 3rd year of carbon cap and trade in the Electric Utilities Center, a collaborative arrangement known as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. But it does ultimately get a little closer to home. There's something called the Western Climate Initiative. Not quite the same cozy ecosystem region of the northeastern United States, but if you're looking at American or Canadian jurisdictions in blue, they are pledged to begin as of next year, January of 2012, of going to the point of their emissions level from 2005 and reducing them by 15 percentage points by 2020. So a very complex arrangement that covers utilities, but other arrangements as well. And then it gets even closer to home. Here, if you are looking at states and provinces in blue, including Michigan, there is a commitment that was reached in 2007 with the governors of those states and the Premier of Manitoba to set similar reduction targets, identical reduction targets for greenhouse gases over the next couple of decades, with lots of questions going forward. Does Michigan stay in? Does Michigan step out? What would this mean? If one is to develop a greenhouse gas cap and trade regime for the Great Lakes Basin, or at least select portions of it, do these regional systems begin to come together and connect? What role might Michigan and other jurisdictions be playing in all of this? And this is only scraping the surface of some of the commitments that have been made by a number of entities in and around the Great Lakes Basin. So the policy choices don't necessarily go away, and hence this provides us an interesting opportunity to ask, what are Michigan citizens thinking about this issue? In turn, when we turn to Chris, how does that weigh against a national American sample? And as Eric will discuss, what are our neighbors in Canada thinking when asked essentially the same questions at the same time? What Chris and I have been working on for several years is what we call the National Survey of Public Opinion on Climate Change. This work began in 2007 with pilot surveys in Michigan and Pennsylvania, has continued through national samples. And so when you see, to some extent in my tables, but more so in Chris's, reference to the national survey or US national, this is what we are talking about. This is a national survey, telephone survey of approximately 1,000 citizens citizens each year. We also see, and you'll see this in my presentation momentarily, we have in some years done oversamples. So you have the large national sample, but then a smaller but still rather large cohort within a particular jurisdiction. For our purposes this year, as in 2007, Michigan. And that work has been supported directly by Close-Up. We've also come to call this the Michigan-Muhlenberg or the Muhlenberg-Michigan project. There are some things that are different about our respective institutions, but one is that we both have the block M as our respective logo, although you can guess which one is painted in red and has a mule kicking out. It's the one from Muhlenberg College. And today we actually become the 3M project by adding our colleague from Montreal, Michigan, Muhlenberg, Montreal. It's going to be a lumpy acronym by the time we put all of this together, but really try to pull some of these survey units together. So what are some of the things that we're finding on the Michigan side? Well, there are three large themes that we've tended to look at in these surveys, and our presentations will look at this in varying degrees. One is public understanding of this issue. Is climate change occurring? Whether it's due to human causation or other effects, is it a big deal or not? Is it something to which attention might be paid, resources might be devoted, or not? What are the role of respective governmental levels? For an issue that conventionally have been framed as an international regime responsibility with only a few large nation states involved, why have we seen so many local, county, state, regional governments begin to play a role? And what does the public think about that? If the public sees any role for government at all, how does that vary by level of government? And then what about policy options? There are many, many ways. Interesting to have a conversation like this in a school of public policy. If one wants to reduce greenhouse gases, what are the different tools, pricing mechanisms, and the like that might be employed to try to achieve that end? We'll talk a little bit about the trade-off and interplay of some of these. So, Michigan views on this subject. A question that we've raised in our survey, but we also are building off of surveys that have been done for quite some time, is just a very simple question. Do you think there is solid evidence of warming global temperatures over the last 40 years? We're not getting at human causation, what might be causing this. Is it happening or not? And where does Michigan come out? And here you see what has been picked up in other surveys. November 2007, 80% of Michiganders saying, yeah. And look at that drop. November 2010. Chris will actually be unpacking this issue a little bit more, what contributes or how we come to understand what's going on in climate and relate that to understanding of science and the like. And you'll see here comparisons between Michigan and the national average, although I probably won't pull that out too much except in cases where there's substantial variation. Well, another way to look at this, and we have 3 or 4 different ways to begin to ask this question. It's not just, is there solid evidence of warming, but have you seen localized effects? What do you think? Well, in this case, you see the broad distribution. This is, again, the 2010 Michigan numbers. You go left to right, strongly agree, some would agree, and you see that divide of opinion. And then can compare that with a national sample. In Michigan, there's some degree of variation, but this is a kind of spread that we've been seeing in recent years whenever we look in the United States. What about levels of government? Here I think we see some interesting pieces and interesting developments. One is, note that even in some cases, probably people who may not be convinced that global temperatures are warming or think that this is a particularly severe issue, still think attention ought to be paid. And policy engagement may make some degree of sense across levels of government. These findings actually surprised us, but may actually contribute to some extent to explain why we've seen a mixture of local, state, and federal engagement on this issue. Again, looking at federal levels of engagement and the bar on the left indicating a great deal of responsibility and then on down the line, but still rather high numbers in this 2010 Michigan sample for state and local involvement as well, before we get to the particulars of what that kind of involvement might entail. One thing we've done a little bit differently this year with our partners in Close-Up, as some of you may know, Close-Up for several years now has looked at what we would call expert public opinion. Most of the numbers you see are when we do a telephone survey of a random sample of Americans or Canadians. In this case, you're seeing those numbers here. This is very similar to the bar chart that you just saw a moment ago. But as some of you may know, the Ford School and Close-Up have launched this project whereby they engage in an extensive survey of local government experts, lead elected officials and appointed officials in municipalities and counties throughout the state of Michigan. And so we were able for the first time this year to ask, what does the general citizenry think in comparison to people who are prominent in local government circles? And here I think is an interesting finding. You don't see that much difference in terms of citizen or local government official reaction to whether the federal government should have a great deal of responsibility. But you jump down here to the state level, you begin to see some variation. Local government officials less convinced that the citizenry of a major role. Similarly with local officials. These are not minor shifts. So again, in this case, it's always interesting to think when you're sampling public opinion groups, how variations might occur. We actually had anticipated perhaps that local officials would be more engaged and interested in this, but obviously the reverse holds to be the case. Now this could be eye chart time, and I don't want to dwell on this slide too much because it might be difficult to read, but this begins to move us a little bit more specifically toward individual policy tools and questions going forward for Michigan. How do the citizens of Michigan feel about Michigan engaging unilaterally on an issue or vis-a-vis possible federal involvement? Just quickly, these four themes that we've been looking at in a number of venues, looking at federalism issues, different kinds of considerations. Across the top, the very first one, the federal government should allow state governments to adopt stricter standards for the emission of greenhouse gases than any federal standards. We were really intrigued by this issue because, in part, so many proposals in recent Congresses, actually over the last 4 Congresses, have looked at the very possibility that state policies would be wiped out or eviscerated under some kind of federal regime. As we look at these numbers, there's actually fairly strong support for agreement with the idea that states should be allowed to race to the top or go above the bar if they so choose. The second line, and this is an interesting one to think about, I think, given questions of economic competitiveness and how a state positions itself or portrays itself in focusing on energy, alternative energy, taxation structures, and the like. Not a small issue in the state of Michigan or any other state of the basin right now, where the question emerges, my state should not adopt anti-global warming policies unless its neighboring states also adopt similar policies. And we see a pretty strong number of folks on this side of things, arguing that perhaps unilateral action has some basis of support. And here, as you work through a couple of these additional questions, if the federal government fails to address the issue of global warming, it is my state's responsibility to address the problem, where you get pretty substantial numbers saying, yeah, states might want to go for it or ought to go for it. And then this last one, which is going to transition into discussion of some specific policy tools. State governments will boost their economies by requiring greater use of renewable energy. A transition perhaps in part to the discussion of renewable portfolio standards or renewable energy policies more generally. There we find very, very strong support, really cutting across a number of demographic groups in Michigan for that proposition or statement, recognizing that is a very broad blanket statement. It doesn't get into the particulars of how much is it going to cost, adjustments, and the like. But these are some of the views that we have found before we get to particular policies. So what happens when you begin to look at specific policies? Well, there's 6 options that we offered our respondents here. Quickly, renewable portfolio standard, that's the electricity mandate that we discussed, expanding nuclear power, corporate average fuel economy, a long controversial issue in Michigan, cap and trade, which could relate to the Michigan engagement in the Midwest Greenhouse Gas Reduction Initiative, carbon taxes, and then gasoline taxes. Note here that we're giving people a choice. This be a federal policy, a state policy, both levels of engagement, neither or unsure. A couple things that we think are interesting here. One is, notice that the yellow bar, which is negative, goes up the closer you get to the T word, and perhaps begin to inject a pricing element. This is not the first time we have found this. We are not the only ones who have found this at all. But look at the degree of support for renewable electricity mandates, which is a policy that Michigan has in place, as opposed to the kinds of pricing strategies that many economists and policy analysts have argued would be the most cost-effective way to achieve these reductions. We also find it interesting that these purple bars actually score rather high, suggesting shared jurisdiction, both state and federal involvement, rather than the citizenry seeing those as purely the responsibility of one level or one venue of government. Final point before I hand things over to Chris. Having said that and pointed out those large yellow bars that seem to be associated with negativity toward any kind of taxation or carbon pricing, what is the future of cap and trade as Michigan begins to think about this and looks at the possibility of imposing some form of carbon pricing through a regional process? What about carbon taxation at a point where states around the Great Lakes Basin are thinking very hard about where they are going to derive revenue and where they are not going to try to derive revenue for basic governmental functions over the next generation? Is there any significance in how you might spend the revenues that would come from these? And we've been working with this a fair amount. Let me just show you what we know about Michigan so far. Again, Michigan 2010. In a moment you'll see how this compares with national averages. When you ask the question, well, we don't ask the question, gee, what do you think about cap and trade? We put it into a nice lengthy paragraph that tries to describe cap and trade. Not easy in a sentence, not easy in a paragraph, but we do our best. You see this kind of divide. Note that as soon as you put a price on it, $15 a month was the estimate that proponents of the legislation that passed the House of Representatives in May 2009 estimated that implementation of that legislation would have cost $15 per family for a year. And you see a bit of a drop. And then when you go to $50, you begin to see further drop. In other words, in this case, in an abstract sense, cap and trade actually has a majoritarian base of support. When you add a specific price, it begins to drop a bit. When that price goes up, it really drops quite substantially. Well, what about carbon taxes? Well, we would assume that carbon tax is the least likely, even though from many policy perspectives could be one of the more desirable ways to go about this, pricing the negative externality. Well, in this case, it's clear more folks oppose a fossil fuel tax or a carbon tax than support. But we find here at relatively lower levels, there's actually a bump up. This comes up even in a more pronounced way in some other surveys. At a relatively low level, things go up a bit, and then they plunge when the numbers go up. But the last point I would just raise is we've begun in this survey to ask not just how you feel about having government extract revenue from you through a tax, but how do you feel about how that revenue might be utilized? And does the framing of how you take revenue and utilize it change people's views or perceptions on issues? So imagine a scenario where government imposed a carbon price, where we don't really get into the particular details, but explain a mechanism whereby government extracts revenue that's related to consumption of fossil fuels. But you give people a choice in terms of where that might be allocated. Deficit reduction, reducing payroll taxes, allow them to jump forward and say, don't do it, retract, cover governmental spending, or alternative energy. We were really struck by this in Michigan. Along the bottom, you see a number of issues and options. Of the 7 options, this is off the charts. This is way ahead of national averages. If this is a correct sample, if you give Michiganders the word that a carbon price is going to be imposed, however they might respond to that in abstract terms, they have clear preferences to how that money might be used. Alternative energy, research and development, as opposed to every possible mechanism that has been proposed. And we actually do think that there is more to be considered here. Not that you earmark every source of revenue to try to build political support, but as we begin to move forward and think about framing and packaging of issues, is there some kind of connection or linkage that might come into play? Among the takeaways here, and this will be coming forward in other presentations as well, public opinion on this issue is volatile. Think of the very first slide and the fact that you've seen nearly a 20% drop in a couple of years, or whether people believe global temperatures have declined over the last 40 years. That's a big shift. We also think that personal and local experience may factor into this in very, very significant ways. And so this is very much in play. We also think it interesting that across governmental levels, there is support for some degree of policy engagement among Michiganders, nationally as well. And we also think going forward, and think of the sort of the political food fight over carbon and cap and trade in other areas in the last few years, we do think that this question of how you frame, not just in a slick rhetorical way, shifting from the frame of climate to energy, although that could be part of the issue, but this whole question of where dollars go, how they are utilized, and how they are developed may have some traction going forward, at least from a Michigan perspective. But now I'm delighted to pass the baton to Chris to play this out against a U.S. federal level. Chris.
What we're going to go over is the National Survey of American Public Opinion in the national perspective. Barry did a wonderful job of pulling out what the Survey of Michigan residents said, and a little bit of comparison points about how U.S. and Michigan public opinion may be different and where it might come together. And Eric's going to do a great job of tying together American versus Canadian public opinion. But I want to share, if I could here, some data about the National Survey of American Public Opinion. And Barry did a great job of filling us in a little bit about where it was. This project began in its national format in 2008 after our pilot studies in 2007. Surveys have been run in 4 different periods, in fall of 2008, fall of 2009, spring 2010, and I'll talk about that one, fall 2010, and hopefully we're looking to do another version of this in the spring of 2011, so we could have some seasonally adjusted numbers, which I'll talk about later, which is something interesting. Partnership of University of Michigan and Muhlenberg over in Pennsylvania, and it's designed, as Barry said, to do a couple of functions. First, examine views of Americans on the existence of climate change. Do we believe it's happening? Is it occurring? What's our beliefs there? The determinants of those beliefs, something that we're very interested in. If you believe, why do you believe? Or if you don't believe, if you're skeptical, what leads you to that skepticism? What are the factors that push you in that direction? And then finally, public support for climate policies, and in particular, our niche, if you will. There's a lot of climate surveys. We're really interested in the subnational levels. What is it about states and local governments and how the interplay between the states and national and local governments in a federal system? And luckily enough, Canada, a fellow federalist country, we could exchange some of those same numbers there. And so that'll be interesting when Eric comes out. Just a couple quick things about our survey, the fall 2010, for people that love methods like me. It's 916 completed telephone interviews, a sample of both landlines and cell phones in the U.S. They were conducted last November and December, so they're relatively new in terms of data, with the margin of error plus or minus 3. So it gives us a pretty good sense of a national picture. Now, for some of our sub-units, those margins of error are bigger. I always have to remember that, but a little bit of background. Okay, we'll start with the overall picture. And Barry gave us the comparison of 2010 in Michigan versus the United States, and where Michigan stands a little bit more likely to believe than U.S. citizens overall. But here you can see the numbers between fall 2008 and fall 2010. And what we've seen is a diminished beliefs from fall 2008. If I can show it up here. That's the belief levels. Over 70% nationally in 2008, down into the lower 60s in 2009, and bottoming out at 52% in the spring of 2010, last March in 2010. And now rising slightly, about a 6-point gain or an increase over the last year from the spring to the fall of this year. So a modest increase in numbers. And these parallel a lot of the other national surveys that are measuring overall belief, really do mirror this. If you look at the Pew numbers, they're almost identical. Some other surveys, because of question wording, might differ a little. But we've noticed a change in public opinion in a pretty significant way over a short period of time. And when you look at public opinion on broad issues, it's rare to see those type of jumps. You'll see them in electoral politics. You'll see them on some what I'll call quick hitting issues. But when it gets down to some of these bigger, broader issues, it's weird to see this. And first of all, if you looked at the trend before we started picking up some of the national trends, over a lot of the last decade, it was a steady increase. from, in the 50, 60% mark at the beginning of the decade all the way up to the 70, 80%. So seeing a drop in a short period of time was really something that took a lot of people off guard and went against expectations. So what we want to do is look at, well, who changed their beliefs? What factors might affect beliefs, and get a little picture or a profile. So what this is a simple breakdown of belief by some of the most common demographic categories that we might use. And you could see it's the ones I put up here, and there's many more, but I picked up partisanship, gender, age, and college education, some of the things that we often expect to be predictors of public opinion if you look at the broad literature. And you can see, hopefully with just a quick view of this data, that there's one factor that tends to be the greatest driver of public attitudes towards climate change, and that's partisanship. If you look at Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, in this case, you'll see that Republicans are almost 30% less likely than Democrats to say yes, that there is evidence of climate change, and with independents someplace in between. Now we have a pretty small Tea Party member or group. Interesting, just from our small sample, and again, I won't make that much of it. They were a little bit higher in belief, but a little bit high above national averages in terms of disbelief, or at least compared to Republicans. We'll talk more about them later. But you'll see, again, some pretty big movement when it gets to partisanship, pretty big differences between people that identify themselves differently. When you look at some of the other classic indicators of public opinion, those shifts aren't really well. If our national average is 58%, you don't see a lot of deviation from the 58% mark. You see a little bit in terms of age, with older Americans less likely to believe than some of the younger cohorts, but nothing as dramatic as you see in the partisanship factors. This confirms a lot of our expectations that partisanship is the lens to climate attitudes in the United States. And I think Eric will show some Canadian numbers that find similarities. It's something that's emerging and I think very important. So one is who you are. Now the other question that we've really been asking are the causes of global warming, is to get at what's leading to those beliefs or how you might view them. Now this is, Barry showed a little bit about this in Michigan, but you can see in this particular chart, it's a mixture of perspectives. Now we're really, as we've been doing our research on public attitudes regarding this matter, I think you can't overstate the importance of this. Often people simply lump together believers and non-believers into cohorts and say that's the key demographic difference. I don't think that's the case. Barry doesn't think it's the case. That we think there's really important differences, and we could show in some of the more deeper analysis that we do. If you ask people why among believers, now these are only believers, why they think it's happening, you'll see generally in the area 35 to 40% in our surveys, individuals saying it's human activity. You'll also see somewhere in the range down here of 15 to 20% in that range, people saying natural patterns. But you see, usually the largest group is some combination of both natural and anthropogenic causes of global warming. Now, what's so important about that is when you try to categorize these individuals and how they might come out on policy positions and other matters, they are distinctly different groups. Someone that believes in climate change but for natural causes may share very little in the way of public attitudes and perceptions to policy options with someone that believes it's because of human-induced factors. And that often gets washed out. And we can make a lot of, we have reams of data, as you might guess, that show how those policy differences are. And it's a really important point that we wanted to stress. We go further. One of the most interesting things I think about this survey, and something that we've really wanted to push, was asking open-ended questions of Americans regarding their beliefs in climate change. So if we had you on the phone and we were doing our survey, and we're talking to Don here, and we say, Don, do you believe? And Don says, no, I don't believe. No, Don says, I would imagine, well, we're not going to put you on the spot, Don, but we'll say you believe. And Don, we're going to assume that. And then we say, well, the next question is, what is the primary reason why you believe? And Don, or whoever we talked on the phone, would have a chance to give an open-ended comment. And what we do is categorize those into our data set and try to make sense of what those reasons are. This is the compendium. We've asked this in the fall of 2008, the spring of 2010, and again in the fall of 2010. These are the coded categories. So if an individual told us, they said, well, you know what, it's just warmer. I think it's just warmer than it used to be. It seems warmer. They would be lumped in the warmer temperature categories. If they say, well, I've seen a lot stronger storms than I used to, it would be in a warm weather change. If they said evidence of melting glaciers or polar ice, that we put them in those categories. Now, what's interesting is, especially if you look at some of those, I'll just give one little nugget. Warmer temperatures, in the spring of 2010, those numbers had gone down to 15%. Back in 2008, it was among the same category of the leading categories: glacier melting, warmer temperatures, weather changes. It dropped in the spring of 2010 when we did the survey last March. Not surprisingly, that was after the joyous winter of 2009 and 2010. When we went back in the fall and asked the same questions, it was a 7% increase when we asked this in the fall after an abnormally hot and dry summer in most parts of the United States, up to 22%. What's going to be fascinating to see if this is a seasonal fluctuation when we go back into the field this spring. Is it simply an artifact? When you look at the open-ended comments, you see many references to personal observations and experience. The lens that we get from what we see in meteorological events shapes our views of broader climate, and I think we'll make a case. And just to show that case, let's go to the skeptics, a reason for rejection of climate change. Among those individuals that told us in the survey they do not believe climate change is occurring, we asked the same question, well, almost the same question. Why do you believe that temperatures on Earth are not increasing? We frame it in what's the primary reason. And interestingly, look at personal observations. So if you said, well, I don't believe in climate change because I don't see it happening. 43% last spring said that. 43% said, well, it's something I'm observing, compared to only 29% that had that as their reason when we talked to them last fall. And again, if you look at the individual responses that they have, often they're citing what they see. So it's an interesting element of the survey, and Eric's going to have some comparative data up from Canada. One of the questions we asked, and Barry alluded to, was we give a series of statements that look at agreement with those statements that we are putting together that have some of the arguments that skeptics pose towards the existence of climate change. And we ask the public to react to those through agreements, to either strongly agree, somewhat agree, the standard questions. This is an example of one of those. This is a questioning of the evidence of climate change. In particular, we asked, are scientists overstating evidence of global warming for their own interest? Now, I guess we could say it's lucky for us that ClimateGate, the whole issue of emails that came out last year, a little over a year ago, occurred in the middle of our survey period. So we had the test, if you will, to see if the effect of that incident back in the fall of 2010 might have affected. Now, in the fall of 2008 and fall of 2009, that's before the ClimateGate incident occurred, and you can see the numbers generally around in the high 30s. Right after our first polling in the period post-ClimateGate, you could see the numbers of both agreement increasing and disagreement with those statements declining. And it doesn't give the whole picture. I wish I could put them all on the slide, it would get busy. We have measure intensity, right? Strong agreement and strong disagreement. We saw those things really peak after ClimateGate, in other words, and how people reacted to that incident in their beliefs. It looks like there might be a little bit movement back to the pre-ClimateGate numbers occurring, but again, that'll be fun to see as we track over time if that had an effect. One area that critics of climate communication and climate policy often point to is the media presentation of climate issues. And the same type of question we ask about climate scientists is the media overstating evidence regarding global warming. And I think what you'll see in this is there has been a steady increase, maybe not steady, but an increase over time in general of agreement with that premise, while a decrease in the number of Americans that disagree. You've seen more and more critical nature, especially among skeptic communities or groups of individuals that are doubtful of climate change, that the media is playing a major role in trying to trump up the issue, and I think our evidence paints a bit of a picture of that. One question that we just started asking, and I just wanted to pop up to give a little perspective, and it's going to be fun to look at over time, is adaptation versus mitigation. Should we, as a policy directive, try to simply put our focus into adapting to climate change, or should we continue to focus on mitigation or fighting its evolution? And what you'll see is, and not much change between the fall of 2009 and fall of 2010, very little movement in terms of agreement. About, between around 25% of Americans agreed with the statement regarding moving to a more adaptive strategy, but a solid majority of Americans disagree with that and continue to push that mitigation is a better approach. So it's again, not a lot of detail on that, but an interesting angle that we hope to do a lot more with in the future. Barry talked a little bit about the role of government in addressing global warming, and this is just a breakdown over time, and I think you see a general consistency of the trend. This is just for the great deal of responsibility. Do you think each level of government has a great deal? And we've seen consistent numbers, generally consistent. Most agree for the federal government, and similar trends for both the states and locals. Not a lot of movement. I think it really gets interesting when you compare it, like Barry did, at the state level and how it might be regional and state differences on this, but I just wanted to get to that. And then finally, the willingness to pay. Policy positions are one thing. Barry had an example of that in the abstract. If we ask you, do you support a policy option, it's generally easy to say yes. But when you apply a monetary figure to that policy option, all bets are off, and the dynamics change considerably, as you would guess. Willingness to pay, how much would you pay each year for more renewable energy to be produced, has had a significant movement over the course of our surveys. In particular, as you can see, between 2008 and the fall of 2010, almost a doubling of Americans saying that they would pay nothing for increased renewable resources. Major change in terms of what we're willing to deal in terms of personal finance. As you could see, the counter effect also, if you look at the high end, $500 or more, $250 to $499, some of the larger numbers we used, a decrease in those areas. Willingness to pay is something that in the end is going to mean a lot, and Americans simply are not as willing to pay in a 2-year period as they were. Now, of course, this was during an economic recession. The effects of that have to be discussed, but the bottom line is it's changed significantly. Here's some of the views on support for cap and trade from a national level. This is, Barry shared a little bit about this before. We have the general view. So if you ask Americans about their general view of cap and trade, in the fall of 2009 versus the fall of 2010, you've seen a decline in the percentage of residents of the United States that say they'll support cap and trade. And then as you get to the categories, what if the increase was by $15 a month or $50 a month? You've seen similar decreases. It really drops off, as the Michigan numbers showed, when we get to the $50 amount, but considerable drop-offs even on the national sample for the $15 a month. I'm basically out of time, and the same large scenario goes for the support for the carbon tax that Barry showed, a little bit of a jump up at the $15 number. But conclusions, where are we? Where are we with public opinion? There's been a small rebound in public attitudes and perceptions regarding acceptance of climate change since the low we saw last spring. It'll be very interesting to see if that small rebound survives some of the weather phenomena of the winter, and if those numbers are continuing to hold as we go back into the field this spring. Both those who believe global warming is happening and those who are skeptical of its existence regularly and significantly point to those meteorological functions. It'll be something that we're going to keep an eye on. And the public generally sees a role for all level of governments in the United States in dealing with climate change, but has indicated a diminished willingness to pay for such efforts. And of course, those diminished willingness to pay numbers are going to have an impact on what actually gets done. That's the scene in the U.S., but what about the picture up north in Canada? And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Eric, and he's going to fill us in with some perspective on how Canadians stand on climate matters and how they compare it to the American population.
In the few minutes I have today, I'd like to situate the Canadian findings in a comparative Canada-U.S. context. And I'd like to preface my talk with just a few words on why I think this comparative why we think this comparative exercise is important. As alluded to in Chris and Barry's presentations, we've essentially replicated the study done over time in the United States in Canada. And this allows us to compare where the public stands in two very similar countries. Now, I can say this because as a Canadian, as you know, we like to compare. We like to compare ourselves in particular to the United States. Usually this means pointing out our differences in terms of our different healthcare systems, our different social safety nets, and sometimes our different foreign policies. We like to underscore those differences. And we even like to compare our hockey teams and our favorite ales. But underlying these small differences are very large and undeniable similarities between the two countries. In particular, the two countries share a broad set of characteristics that make an analysis of climate change policy and attitudes towards climate change policy particularly interesting of study. For instance, both countries are among the most greenhouse gas intensive in the world, both on a per capita basis and in terms of greenhouse gas intensity of our tightly integrated economies. That's the greenhouse gas intensity. Contributing to these facts, we're both among the least densely populated countries in the world, and our populations are on a significantly large landmass, which means we like to drive around a lot. Both in terms of movement of peoples and movement of goods. We really rely on automobile transportation, truck transportation, and emit fossil fuels. So our greenhouse gas emissions patterns and our reliance on automobiles and road transport means that at the very aggregate, general, abstract level, macro level, we might have similar interests. We do have objectively similar interests and constraints in terms of limiting our use of fossil fuels. So the big question is, given these similarities in terms of high per capita greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas intensity, and a general reliance on fossil fuels, where do the two publics stand on climate change? At first blush, we might expect broad similarities, but underneath, if we look closer, we find some pretty big differences. In addition, both Canada and the United States are federal systems, implying important roles for multiple governments at different levels. And like the case in the United States, Canada has had some issues implementing a coordinated federal government response to climate change. And I won't spend too much time because I want to get to the public opinion and I have way too many slides. But I wanted to give a bit of a background on the Canadian policy context that gives us a bit of a backdrop against which we can look at public opinion. Generally speaking, initially the federal government in Canada was actually quite engaged in the climate change issue. Going back to 1988, when it first emerged on the Canadian government agenda at the Toronto conference, then Prime Minister of Canada, Brian Mulroney, had set at the Toronto conference, had set the Toronto target, which was very ambitious, of a 20% reduction below 1998 by 2005. We've obviously moved beyond 2005, and our emissions in Canada have gone up 35%. Followed by the Rio and Earth Summit, where the goal was to stabilize emissions at 1990 levels. I can actually show you this on the next slide. I have a pointer. So Toronto conference was here. Our emissions are up there. There's quite a gap. The Kyoto commitments, one of the big differences between Canada and the U.S. Federal climate change policies, Canada had both signed and ratified Kyoto, but we're nowhere near meeting our targets. In conjunction, in order to meet these targets, a number of plans on the top of the line chart, a number of plans were implemented by various governments, including the Green Plan, the National Action Plan, the Action Plan 2000, and none of them actually worked out in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Just going back here to the policy, so how does this translate into policy? Did the targets, is it a policy failure? Well, no. Actually, if you look at the policy context at the federal level, very little policies were implemented to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of plans, very little in terms of policy. Cap and trade has been talked about since 2003, and we're no more closer today than we were in 2003 in terms of getting a cap and trade system off the ground. A carbon tax was discussed at least on 2 occasions during the Kyoto negotiations, as well as more recently with Stéphane Dion, Liberal Party leader Stéphane Dion, campaigned on a carbon tax proposal in the last federal election and lost by a landslide. So we're left with an eco-energy program, which is modest subsidies for energy retrofits, and an explicit, and this I think is an important point, especially when looking at public opinion, an explicit policy of harmonizing with the United States. So Canada's policy right now is to wait and see what happens in the United States, and then we'll move and try and coordinate a response with the United States, which means that the public opinion in the US is almost more important than Canadian public opinion in terms of policy. It's one way of looking at it. Now, in this context of dismal policy performance at the federal level, the provinces have begun taking action in their own hands. And this is a relatively recent phenomenon. The provinces did lag the U.S. state-level governments in implementing policies, but they've actually become real policy innovators. So the provinces, 3 of the largest provinces have implemented their own targets, or have set their own targets, which exceed or are more ambitious than the current federal targets. They have implemented or developed their own action plans, and there are quite a few examples of real policy innovation. The Quebec in 2007 implemented the first carbon tax outside of Europe. It's a very modest carbon tax. It's 9 cents or 0.9 cents per liter of gasoline, which works out to about 4 cents per gallon. Followed by BC, that implemented its own carbon tax at 10 Canadian dollars per ton of CO2 in 2008. That's up to $25 per ton of CO2 presently, which works out to 18 cents per gallon on a gallon of gasoline. Ontario was the first jurisdiction outside of Europe to implement a feed-in tariff, and a feed-in tariff goes a little bit beyond renewable portfolio standards by offering independent power producers a preferential rate for any electricity they produce from renewable energy. Currently, that's 80 cents per kilowatt hour for small solar, rooftop solar, while Canadians generally pay 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So there's a significant gap between the preferential rate and what Canadians pay. So to summarize, 2 very similarly situated countries in terms of greenhouse gas intensities and per capita emissions. Similar policy context, retreat at the federal level, and a lot of action at the subnational level. Questions we're asking here are, where does the public stand? How does the public feel about provincial action and federal inaction? Does the public see a greater role for the federal government? What does the public think about climate change? How do they understand climate change? And finally, what types of policies do they prefer? This has already been introduced, but a quick word. It's the identical survey instrument administered to the Canadian population. Our sample size was about 1,200 respondents, done by telephone. except we excluded cell phones because legally you can't run surveys on cell phones in Canada. The fielding dates were from the 13th of January to February 4th, and that actually corresponds to a cold snap across the country in that period. So it'll be interesting to look at the numbers in that context. A 36% response rate and a margin of error of plus or minus 2.8%. So this is the difference between belief in global warming between the American and Canadian publics. As can be seen, this is a pretty big difference, and I was actually quite surprised by this difference. 4 years ago, polls in Canada were suggesting that Canadians didn't know what global warming was. All of a sudden today, 80% believe in global warming. Unfortunately, we don't have the time series data, but we're going to start tracking this in the future and see how this plays out. This is also surprising because it's post-ClimateGate. I have another slide on how Canadians feel about about the integrity of scientific evidence. It's also surprising given the fact that this survey was administered during a cold spell. But importantly, these aggregate numbers mask important regional differences. So this is public opinion in Canada, or belief in climate change in Canada, broke down by the different provinces. And you'll notice the different colors in the map of Canada. The darker the red, the more greenhouse gas intensive is the province. So this is Saskatchewan, this is Alberta, both of our most heavily greenhouse gas intensive provinces. You can see that belief in global warming is significantly lower in the greenhouse gas producing, fossil fuel energy producing provinces relative to greener provinces, and Quebec is green with 85%. I think also important to point out here is that the region with the highest belief in global warming is in the Maritimes, to the right, on the east coast. And the hypothesis I have here is that they are more vulnerable to the storms and whatnot. So the opinion on the East Coast is, belief is higher on the East Coast. Belief in global warming by party identification. Here too, we find significant differences, or a big significant difference in in belief in global warming by party ID, and it's really the Conservative Party supporters. So the party to the right, it would be equivalent, I guess, to the Republicans in the United States, where belief is significantly lower than all other parties. We can come back to these. I apologize. I will have to go a little bit quickly over these slides. The top 3 reasons in the open-ended question that Chris had mentioned, top 3 reasons cited for belief in climate change. One way to break it down is by looking at it in terms of direct experience, indirect experience, and deference to scientific authority. And we see that direct experience, direct personal observations, is the modal category, the most cited reason reported for believing in global warming, followed by, in the United States, melting glaciers. That was actually the 3rd highest in Canada, and deference to scientific authority was actually a little bit higher in Canada than the United States. Together, these 3 factors account for about 60% or 66% of the reasons given for belief in global warming. So 3 factors explain quite a bit. So what about ClimateGate? Here we see that Canada is in red and the United States is in blue. Here we see that Canadians are about 10% less likely to agree with the statement that scientists are overstating the global warming case for their own interests, and are more than 10% more likely to say that these accusations have no merit. The finding in some ways contradicts what one of my professors during grad school at the University of Toronto, some of you you might know him, Neil Nevitt, had written a book on the decline of deference in Canada. Well, here we have some evidence suggesting that Canadians are actually more deferential to scientific authority than their continental cousins. So what about the role of respective government levels? Well, the public in both countries generally assign some responsibility to each level of government. That's the general story in these two graphs here. So 5 minutes, wow. Okay, this is consistent with actual policies implemented on the ground by local and state provincial governments that was mentioned earlier. There is somewhat of a disconnect, however, between a general preference, not a general preference, but a general willingness to say that federal government has a great deal of responsibility on the one hand, and a federal retrenchment in both countries, or federal inability to act at the federal level in both countries. So there's actually a bit of a disconnect there between the responsibility assigned to the federal government and what the federal government actually does in both countries. The last point I'd like to draw your attention to on this slide is that Canadians are generally more likely to say a great deal of responsibility, irrespective of which level of government we're looking at. I'm just going to skip over these and get to the policy preferences. So now we begin to touch on the policy preferences of the American and Canadian publics, or I'd like to touch on the preferences of the Canadian and American publics, and look at carbon pricing. So how does the public feel about policies that experts say are the best? Does experience with market-based mechanisms affect opinion of them? And that's kind of an interesting kind of a quasi-experiment we could do with our data, given the fact that several Canadian provinces have gone ahead and implemented carbon pricing policies. We can see if there are significant differences in levels of support for these types of policies in places where they have actually been implemented. Another question we could ask is, if cap and trade, at what scale does the public prefer this to be implemented at? And if carbon pricing, how should revenues be used? Something Barry mentioned in his talk. So support for cap and trade in Canada and the United States. Well, support for cap and trade tends to be lower in the United States than in Canada. Opposition to cap and trade in the US increases as respondents are told how much it will cost, as I think Chris mentioned, as they're told that once you're told that it's going to cost you more money, opposition increases from 49% to 59%, and ultimately at $50 per month, 74%. In contrast, opinion in Canada is relatively more stable, or support in Canada is relatively more stable, irrespective of the costs associated with cap and trade. So support barely changes when respondents are asked, or when respondents are asked whether or not they support cap and trade in theory or in the abstract. And then once the dollar amounts are added, we see very small changes, very little change. So support across the board for the cap and trade. So who supports cap and trade in Canada? If we look at support for the principal idea of cap and trade, so here I'm looking at the no-cost option, and we look at that in light of support for the various political parties in Canada. Here we see quite a bit of variance, actually. Surprisingly, support for cap and trade is lowest among Green Party supporters. However, the tables turn when we look at the carbon tax, as we shall see. So the Green Party, it's not to say that Green Party supporters don't want a price on carbon, it's that the debate has gotten so politicized in Canada that the Greens don't like cap and trade anymore. They much prefer a carbon tax. The New Democratic Party supporters, which is the party of the left in Canada, the Labour Party, party with unions, the party representing a lot of unions in Canada, are also less supportive of the idea, with 43% of NDP supporters reporting disagreement with cap and trade. At the other end of the spectrum, support for cap and trade is highest amongst Bloc Québécois supporters, which is the federal level Quebec Nationalist Party. Closely followed by supporters of the Liberal Party of Canada, and Conservatives fall somewhere in between. I'm just going to jump to, well, this is an interesting slide. The provinces in red are provinces with that are actively negotiating and members of the Western Climate Initiative. And we see that those provinces that are part of the Western Climate Initiative are also significantly, the bold means significantly higher in support for cap and trade. So support for cap and trade or opposition to cap and trade, support for cap and trade does not decrease with experience in negotiating the WCI. Conversely, the least likely to support cap and trade, again, is Alberta, oil-producing Alberta. Really quickly, to finish on carbon taxation, I find this slide really interesting as well. Generally speaking, again, Canadians are more likely than Americans to support a carbon tax. But something really interesting I find here is going on. And I think it's evidence of what we might think of as a blind aversion to the tax word. You ask Canadians, do you agree with a carbon tax? 51% will say they agree. Once you attach a dollar figure of $15 a month, all of a sudden, okay, well, maybe my bias against carbon, the tax word isn't so bad. The sky's not falling down. $15 a month, I can handle that. Support actually goes up for the carbon tax. And resistance, opposition goes down, which I thought was quite interesting. I think some of this was also seen in some of the US data, but it's something that we're going to have to parse out a little bit more. Now, I've run out of time. I'm just going to briefly go through. Well, here's another kind of cool slide. Where we have carbon taxes, we're also significantly more likely to support them. Although support is highest in Manitoba, which does not have a carbon tax. And I will conclude, because I'm essentially out of time, just looking forward in terms of research directions. One idea is to flesh out the ideology and partisanship relationship, because one of the problems by saying, you know, people believe in climate change because they're conservative or Republican, there's a causality problem there. Do I deny climate change because I'm conservative or Republican? Or do I identify with the Conservative or Republican Party because their position on climate change accords with my own? So there's some further work to be done. I think we can flesh that out a little bit more. I'd like to, or we'd like to, push forward with comparison at the sub-federal level. So one of the things, I just got my hands on this data. One of the things we'd like to do is look more closely at Michigan and Ontario, differences in Michigan and Ontario. There's actually some evidence that respondents in Michigan and Ontario are more like each other than they are with neighboring provinces or states. And that fits into the border region literature in international relations. So that's something to look forward to. The other thing is explaining differences across states and provinces in terms of different interests, vulnerabilities, cultures, and of course, importantly, local perceptions. As was mentioned in the other presentations, local perceptions or personal observations really matter, which is probably one of the main reasons why we disagree about climate change, but that's to be looked at a little bit further, looking at these cross-state and cross-provincial differences. Finally, the big question is, can we generalize preference formation across federal systems? And in order to do that, we need to do more analysis of this data and hopefully get other federal systems involved and compare them as well. That concludes my presentation. I look forward to the question and answers.
So some of these questions, we've got maybe about 10 minutes at this point in time, so I'll try to get them across the board. Let me start with this one. And I think this is for all three of you or any one of you. Do you have any evidence that individuals react differently to the terms climate change versus global warming, particularly in some regions we're not expecting to see large changes in temperature?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that's difficult to test. We've done a couple. I did one project in Pennsylvania where we did a half sample to see if there was any difference in reaction to a number of positions, policy positions, and belief statements if we deployed climate change versus global warming, and we didn't see any difference. It's ironic that the term climate change got its origin a lot, basically from some focus group testing by Frank Luntz back in the early part of the decade to make it less threatening than global warming. But at least in the study that we did or tested, there really wasn't that big of a difference. So.
Anyone else want to add something to that?
I haven't tested for it specifically, but reading somewhere, Mike Hume has a new book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, and he treats the, if you want to call it, social construction of climate change, because climate change is as much a physical phenomenon as it is a social and cultural understanding. And he deals with that at considerable length, so whoever asked that question, I'd look at what Mike Hume has to say about that.
So here's another one that I think is really interesting, and that is, can you explain why the large difference between response to carbon tax between U.S. and Canada?
Do you want me to go? Explain the main difference. So why support is so high, in other words, for carbon taxation in Canada? That's really tough. You know, it's a puzzle too, because I don't think I showed you this slide, but a bit of context. Stéphane Dion was the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada in the last federal election. He campaigned on a carbon tax. Pollsters, his own advisors, told him not to, and he went ahead and did it anyway. He answered someone, I think Mark Jacquard, who's an economist in Canada, once told him, you know, don't do it, even though Mark Jacquard likes carbon taxes. And he said, don't do it, it's bad politics. And Stéphane Dion said, I think good policy is good politics. Well, the Liberal Party was decimated in that election. It was the worst performance that the Canadian Liberal Party had that year. That being said, which supporters of which party do you think are the highest supporters of carbon taxes in this survey? It's the Liberal Party, even after Stéphane Dion's dismal performance. It's a very fascinating question. I don't think I have the answer right now. One of it might be cultural. I mean, I don't think Canadians are as... I don't think anybody likes taxes in general, though. So it's something definitely to think about further. I don't know if Barry has any thoughts.
Just a few. One obviously is this cultural issue. Is there a fundamental difference when you use that term or talk about strategies that look like a tax? A couple of other things, though, and this is where we don't have the longer period in Canada. You know, the last few years have been more robust economically in Canada than in the U.S., and so the numbers have actually dropped a bit, just as in the willingness to pay numbers for the U.S. We can't yet know what that might have meant a few years ago when the respective economies were at a similar level. And I'm also struck, especially given your maps, where the impact of a province nationwide can be quite significant. You do have the experience in British Columbia where a center or center-left government embraced an explicit carbon tax, as you pointed out, going up $10 a year over a 3-year period. Revenue return system.
$5 a year.
Is it $5? Okay, going to capped at 30, isn't it? 30
yeah,
at a time?
capped at 30.
Yeah. But then returning that revenue, and that government won re-election. The extent to which that's known or has impacts in other parts of Canada, I don't know, but we've not had any of the states that have moved in that direction. So there's just not any precedent for that where states have experimented with cap and trade and some of the other policies. So those are some partial possible explanations for that.
And just maybe to piggyback on the economic question and the recession in the United, I noticed a lot of, and we haven't done this yet, but a lot of the willingness to pay in 2008 is similar to willingness to pay in Canada in 2011, early 2011. So the state of the economy, Canada's more, I guess we could say, robust state of the Canadian economy relative to the United States might also explain a willingness to pay and a willingness to absorb higher costs at this point in time.
Okay, thanks. So rather than cross-border comparison, this is sort of within countries, but both of you, please. Or all three of you, please. Can you please explain more fully the power of partisanship behind a person's belief in climate change?
It's another great question, and by far, every poll that we've done at the state level, at the national level, has shown that partisanship is the biggest single predictor. You know, you control for everything, every breakdown we do, every multiple regression and logit that we do. There's just nothing stands out more. It is the lens, and a lot of that has been shaped. By the way, it wasn't always that way. There's always a divide between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals in the United States regarding environmental issues. Maybe back in the 70s it wasn't that pronounced, but over time it's evolved. But in the last few years it's absolutely boomed. Now there's a number of theories for that. One is the media effect. That we've become more balkanized in our media, and therefore we're listening to different messages, and it's creating it. The connection. There's been an outright campaign against cap and trade and other policies that have been targeted on a partisan level, and those things have to have some ramifications. So there's some underlying ideologies. Also, the way Eric frames the question, we've been thinking about too. How much of it is are you drawn to becoming a Republican because of certain positions, and one of those being cap and trade? Now I think that's probably less causal than the other way around, but it's a fascinating question, and I don't know if you have any more.
We have begun to wonder if this argument that was advanced, particularly in Chris's presentation, that sort of all climate interpretation is local. It's one thing to go outside and observe the weather, but then ask how different people or people of different political parties get their information on weather trends, where they might look. And there's not a lot of evidence that UN reports are must reading for most Americans. But perhaps as partisan divides grow, as access to media or recourse to different informational sources divide, literally you might have people turning to very, very different sources on something as seemingly straightforward as weather or climate interpretations. Could possibly play.
I'll just throw in one nugget from a past study that we did back in 2008. We did oversamples in a number of states: California, Louisiana, Virginia, and Pennsylvania at the time. We picked them for policy reasons. But one of the things we noticed that if you were a believer in climate change in Louisiana and you were a Republican, we asked the same questions. What's the number one factor that led you to there? The number one factor, hurricanes, was the number. If you were in California, drought. So back to the localized lens, the all climate is local, mixed with partisanship. Now those same factors weren't true for Democrats and Republicans in those states. They came to it through other means, but they arrived at the same conclusion. So I think that at least complements the argument.
Chris, do you want to add that?
Sure. Just really quickly, I'm not sure it's so much partisanship as it is ideology. I've run some tests, some experiments actually with my students, my undergrad students in a methods course, and we divide them into two groups, and we have them read a book excerpt, a fake book excerpt, of an alleged climate policy expert. One of the book excerpts says climate change poses a high risk and needs a commensurate response. The other book excerpt basically gives the message that climate change poses a low risk, and we can ride it out and see. What we found is, and it's the same picture of a fictitious academic, Harvard, MIT, member of the U.S. Meteorological Society. And what we found is that an individual's political predispositions, left, right, towards egalitarian issues and towards intervention in the economy, is the best predictor of whether or not they judge that person to be an expert. And this is building on Kahan's work and and Jenkins, and it's an experiment. So, like I said, I'm not so convinced that it is partisanship than ideology, which influences people's belief in global warming and their judgment of scientific expert advice.
Thanks. So this one might sting a little bit. It's specifically a question about this survey, but I think to ask it a bit more broadly, and that is, do data like this or these surveys actually impact policy? Does anyone use this information to shape policy?
I'll let Barry
Give
answer that.
I do think that we have seen in the last few years a lot of use and abuse of surveys to the point where you realize that maneuvering a question, like deleting a small phrase, can allow you to jump something 10, 15 percentage points. So survey work can indeed be used as a weapon. On all sides, not unique, of course, to this area. How influential and how instrumental that is actually in policy design or development, is a fair question. I do think it intriguing to go back, Eric, to your slides with the maps of individual provinces and degree of support. And you can almost advance, maybe this is an overstatement, that to some extent democracy works, that people at the subfederal level get the policies they do or do not want. So where cap and trade is in place, support is higher, carbon tax and so forth. Whether or not any polling or survey work contributes to that is unclear. But to the extent it's possible for political officials or leaders to tap into public sentiment through whatever mechanisms, there may be some kind of linkage or correlation. But I'd love to hear from my colleagues, but I would not want to overstate the role that these play.
I can't address the question, does the polling data drive the policy? I'm very confident that the opinion drives the policy. I think Eric's slides did show that. I think a lot of data. I think the larger picture, right, of what we've seen where climate change policy at the national level has gone over the last few years is a testament to that. I mean, the collapse in, I think collapse is too big of a word, the decline in public opinion and support since 2008, even though there was a Democratic Congress, now we have to have the interceding effect of the economy, but the total pass on climate policy at the national level as this drop-off occurred isn't coincidence. And so public opinion matters. I don't know if polls matter.
Yeah, just to finally touch on that. I mean, if opinion drives policy, then why don't we see more action in Canada, given that at the federal level in particular? And I think it's important to note that it's not just opinion at the aggregate level that matters for policy, it's opinion at the more local, concentrated level, because that's where individuals are elected to office and they represent constituencies. So in the electoral system that we have, a first past the post electoral system, it's not just aggregate opinions that matters, it's preferences at the more circumscribed geographical level that matters, I would say.
Let me actually ask my own question. I've asked Barry this before. So all three of you have kind of gone back and forth between saying one of these two phrases. Do you believe in climate change? Do you believe that the climate is changing? I think those are fundamentally different questions. One sounds more religious than the other, to me anyway. Is this part of the challenge of asking these kinds of questions? And how do you get around the implications of that kind of a question, either side?
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful point. And we never use, in our instruments, our design, we never use the word belief. It's difficult to, we won't use it in the structure of a question, but when we interpret the question, we often do. It's an interesting relationship that it's hard to describe. So if we say, just think about I guess the problem. The question, our fundamental question, do you see that there is strong evidence of warming temperatures on Earth over the last 40 decades, right? Or 4 decades. You might come to the conclusion and say, yes, I do. So when we describe that, how are we to describe it, right? I mean, in some ways, well, you believe that. But belief has a connotation issue implied, Don, that belief is something that goes beyond evidence, right? And so the best I can answer, and Barry or Eric could elaborate, it's tricky to communicate the results without using that term, but the term itself has very different implications. I don't know if that...
No, it's another language question. I think these are great questions. I'm just thinking to myself right now whether or not how much of a difference that 80% in Canada, how much that would change if rather than saying, do you believe temperatures are warming, do you believe in the science of global warming? I'm just trying to think through this, what the implications might be. To be fair to the integrity of the survey instrument, though, I do think that it's a lot more objective to say the temperatures are increasing, and so that's kind of it's the language and framing of the language is less an issue when you ask that type of a question.
Just to follow on that and to underscore both points, and certainly Chris's point, we don't use that word in asking the survey. But part of the challenge in this is finding language to take incredibly complex phenomena and put it into a slide, or put it into a question, or some kind of slogan. Whether that is purely for moving forward a policy issue, or to try to distill what public sentiment or belief happens to be on an issue. And I do think this is extraordinarily difficult in any arena of public policy. But when you move to an issue like climate, taking that apart and then even thinking about ways in which one engages in serious conversation about the science, the complexity of science, not to per se convert people one way or another, but to distill that is an enormous challenge going forward for everyone who's involved in it. So, but we've had that discussion before, and it's an intriguing one.
So we got one more, because we're running out of time here. This is sort of interesting. The caveat at the bottom is that media coverage and scientific evidence has really not seemed to have done much to sway public opinion. How would you, or would you, structure a survey whose purpose would be to help proponents of climate change legislation better understand how to frame the issue to get more support?
It's a good question.
How to get the media? I think one of the things we don't look at as much in this survey as a survey designed to actually get information in order to help the framing, I think, because that's not the purpose. But if that were to be the purpose, I think what you'd want to do is you'd want to ask questions probing respondents' receptivity to different arguments, either for or against climate change and the urgency of climate change, and identifying what kind of arguments resonate with the target population you're looking to identify and to convince. I think that would probably be the best approach, so identifying what kind of arguments resonate with either the believers or disbelievers, and then propagating that discourse or that message through the media in order to try and change people's opinions. That's what I would do if I were to do that.
I mean, it sounds crude, but I mean, as you do with a campaign, right? I would do a lot of pre-test, post-test, stimuli-induced ads, pictures, images, scenarios, as much as I can to test those messages to see. I mean, I think in some ways, generally, if you look at the debate, and this is cool, public opinion gets moved, right? In the campaigns that are out there. I do believe that the campaigns run on the side, if you will, that wants to reduce levels of acceptance has been more effective than the side that has maybe tried to increase levels of acceptance. If you look at some of them, I've seen a couple of studies on this and some tests that we've run, just early tests with some of the messages that are done. And I think, especially during the economic climate that we're in, those messages targeted at to try and reduce beliefs have been more effective than the other side. I don't know if you guys agree.
Last word, Barry.
No, I think this is an arena where one could explore, in sports language, a full court press, multiple methods, some experimental, some deliberative, look at bringing different questions and issues together. I mean, just this issue of carbon pricing, where there is this extraordinary consensus that cuts across the field of economics and policy analysis, and senior presidential advisors going back to the Gerald Ford era and on through will say in their memoirs that we knew this was, quote, the right thing to do. From a number of perspectives, how one takes that and transfers that and puts different packages of taxes, expenditures, framing issues really comes into play. Eric has just finished a very fine dissertation soon to be a book, that looks at the experience of governments around the world that have taken these steps. Why, under what circumstances and conditions? And then how does the public engagement, public awareness, and public support fit into that? So I think actually all of the conceivable theories, methods, and disciplines, many of which are arrayed at this university, could be brought to bear to really think constructively about where we might go on this. And the survey instruments that we do is one piece of it, but part of a larger package, I would hope.